Good evening. Welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're so pleased to welcome Peter Ho Davies in support of his new novel, A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself, in conversation this evening with Donovan Hohn. Quick overview of webinars. You heard me as you joined us, but if you're just joining us, the chat is closed, but you may want to keep that chat window open during the event, as I will be dropping links to purchase the novel from Literati Bookstore. And there's a link in the description below if you are watching us later on YouTube. You can submit questions for the Q&A using the Q&A feature available to you at any time, and I will read a selection at the conclusion of the conversation. And as a reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com. Books are available for curbside pickup if they're in the store, or we can have them shipped directly to you at your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. Whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for joining us this evening or this afternoon or this morning, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us from. So, without further ado, I'll introduce our author and moderator this evening. Peter Ho Davies' novel, The Fortunes, won the Ansfield Wolf Award and the Chautauqua Prize and was a New York Times notable book of the year. He's also the author of The Welsh Girl, longlisted for the Man Booker Prize and a London Times bestseller, as well as two critically acclaimed collections of short stories. His fiction has appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, The Paris Review, and Granta, and been anthologized in prize stories, the O. Henry Awards, and Best American Short Stories. And speaking with him this evening, Donovan Hohn, a former editor at GQ and Harper's Magazine, is the author of The Inner Coast and Moby Duck, and the recipient of an NEA Fellowship, a Knight Wallace Fellowship, and a Winning Writers Award. He lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They can't hear your applause, but I ask that you please offer it up and join me in welcoming Peter Ho Davies and Donovan Hohn into your living rooms.
Thank you, John.
Peter, it is so nice to be joining you in conversation and celebration, occasioned by a lie someone told you about yourself, which I've spent a lot of time with and loving every minute of it. As you know, I mean, you and I have known each other for quite some time. I will tell you, like, you and I attended the same graduate program in fiction in the 90s, and you left a wake behind you of, so that we were still very much aware, those of us who came in the cohorts behind you. And I think you had just published The Ugliest House in the World, and just made it in the Best American. So I've been reading you and following you for most of my adult life. So this is
And
really,
don't forget editing me as well, Don.
I did. I edited a short story for Harper's. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And I think, as I told you, I personally would love just to hear a little bit to start with from the novel itself. I still love live readings, and there is something about hearing the author's voice that brings something. So why don't you read a little for us?
I would love to do that. Thank you. And thank you for doing this, Donovan. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I'm just going to read, and we may dip back into the book as we go on this evening. But maybe just the very first page and a bit, the first couple of sections, just to sort of set up some of the premise here. There was a chance the baby was normal. There was a chance the baby was not. Fetus, he told himself. There was a chance the fetus was normal. There was a chance that it was not. She, he told himself. That was the result of one of the tests on the fetus. There was a chance that she was normal. There was a chance that she was not. Jesus. No one could tell them the exact odds, but there was a small chance the baby was normal, a tiny chance, BB-sized, no bigger than a bean, and there was a large chance she was not, a full-grown, adult-sized chance, big as a whale, big as a house. Stretch marks, his wife said, gazing at the pregnant women across the waiting room like distant mountains. That's what I used to be afraid of. So that introduces those first couple of characters and some of the challenges they're going to face.
Yeah, And chance is one of those words that comes back again and again throughout the novel. It seemed to me, I don't think it's just because of the near rhyme, that I felt like that the novel at times there was this tension between chance and choice that kept on coming through. And your protagonist, who's only identified as the father. I'm actually kind of curious about that choice, that there's really, it's not a nameless book. There are some secondary characters, Barb, for instance, who are named, but the core of the novel is this family unit, the mother, the father, the boy. So that was a striking choice to me. But I was your main point of view character, the father. He used to be, he had studied physics once.
Ooh.
And so at times I felt like that you're playing with that idea of physics and chance and numbers, interacting with kind of the moral and emotional narrative of the novel.
Yeah, I think we're actually right now, of course, many of us, in the midst of a moment when we're thinking about numbers, about risk assessment, right? We're often looking at numbers when we read the paper every day. We're thinking about infection rates, all these kind of questions. And I think years ago, when I studied physics, I also studied a little bit of risk assessment. And one of the interesting observations about that is that feeling that while we pay attention to the percentages of a risk, there's also a large emotional component to the way we assess risk. It's the difference between the risk I might undertake if I light a cigarette right now and the risk that I might undertake if somebody put a nuclear power plant in the next town over. While the nuclear risk might actually be smaller than the personal risk of the smoking, the fact that risk is imposed upon me by others changes my relationship to it. So the idea of choosing a risk gives us a sense of power, makes us feel as though we're undertaking it for ourselves, I think, in some way. So that sense of the way numbers and emotions interact with each other is something that goes back to those early studies. And I think probably because I was at that point majoring in physics, the movement from this idea of pure numbers into this sense of the way we individually and emotionally weigh those numbers felt important. I mean, I think that's an element of what's going on in the book. I mean, the chance the characters are obsessing over in the early phases of the book, and that haunts them, I think, for much of the book, is this sense of uncertainty. It's a diagnostic uncertainty. They're very close to certain about the diagnosis of the prenatal testing that they're dealing with, but they can't know with absolute perfect certainty, and yet still have to make a monumental decision associated with that space. So the book is very much about that sort of negotiation with uncertainty. And I suppose in a way that brings me back to your question about the fact that the main characters are not named. It's a third person narrative, but it bumps up against some experiences from my own life. I think the whole of the book is fictional, but certainly parts of it, I think, draw out of life, as is true for most books, I suppose. But the book is interested, I think, in inviting the reader to think about that and to think about where the fact gives over to the fiction or where the fiction gives over to the fact. And so the unnamed quality of the characters maybe invites people to think about, is that him? Could that be the person who's writing this book? And I think that effective uncertainty is something that I want to have for the reader, because I think it's an analog for the uncertainty that the characters themselves are going through. They're facing this diagnostic uncertainty. And I want the reader to also be weighing the uncertainty of, is this true or is this not true? That feels like it's a parallel and a link between reader and character.
Yeah, it was. I was thinking, because we've seen in recent versions of autofiction, the many writers choosing to have their authorial persona share a name with them, even if they're taking fictional liberties, right? And so this choice to have your, I don't know if we would call him an alter ego or doppelganger, but the fiction, the persona of the father, it seems like that puts some distance, the father. It's almost got a quality of fable about it. Like it's like it goes back to, like, there's a mother, there's a father, there's a child, that's really at the core of it. And you could have called him, for instance, the writer or the writing teacher. But in this novel, he's the father. And it seemed like that foregrounds maybe kind of where the heart of the book is.
I think that's true. It's interesting because, of course, the book started as a short story called Chance. And so a lot of these choices were made in the context of that story. And because that story deals with an early episode in which they don't become parents, there's a way in which the designations of the father and the mother feel like temporary labels, right? They're actually trying to lean into or explore, are we that or are we not that? Are we going to be that or are we going to be denied that in some sense? I think going forward, though, the fable-like quality is also an invitation, right? It's that way of thinking into the fact that when we write about parenthood, and one of the difficulties of writing about it, I think one of the hesitations I think I've had is that those experiences are, for anybody who's been a parent, universal, mundane, right? They're often, I think, when we are in the first flush of them as new parents, incredibly new to us and very intense to us. But anybody who's already been that route might say those things are all hat to them, I think, in some ways as well. So there's a odd negotiation here to think about, familiarity and unfamiliarity. And I suppose in some ways, because of the experience of these characters begin with, it's a way of defamiliarizing some of what comes familiarly later on. And maybe a way of thinking that the line between parents and not parents is not as sharp as we might imagine in various ways along the way. The one other thing, though, that I was thinking, actually, I was looking back through your book, The Inner Coast, the other day. And you have a great line very near the end of that book. I'm going to quote yourself back to you. It struck me, I hadn't read this before I was writing the book, but if I had, I think it would have spoken to me in this particular regard. All human lives are poignantly right when seen intimately, but from a distance. And I'm not sure I necessarily want to make that claim for the characters in my book, but that sense of seen intimately but from a distance, that does feel like something that it puts a finger on something that I'm interested in the context of the book. So I appreciate you giving me the language for that.
I'll use it for your book. I mean, I found it, and I do think I agree with you. I think that I can't speak for people who aren't parents because I am one, but I would imagine that that's not going to be a barrier to access to the book. I think the book makes wonderfully legible, like the kind of fine-grained experience of just being a consciousness in those strange moments. Sometimes there'll be like when you're a new parent, they're extremely intense, and so you remember everything. But there are times where you also manage to capture the blur of years passing, the birthdays bleeding together. Right? I was paying attention to how time worked in the book, but as a parent, I can also say there was a genuine pleasure in seeing on the page, maybe for the first time, actually. I was trying really hard to think of works of fiction where I felt that somebody had captured what it's like to be a parent, certainly in the 21st century. Just the little things about, like, you mark time in the book using the phrase, "it was the age of." Right. So we get things like, "it was the age of Star Wars," or perhaps my favorite, because I'm a longstanding lover of aquariums, the joke, and there's so many, the banter between the mother and father is delightful, but they call it the age of aquariums when suddenly we're doing natural history. Little things like that, or the texture of like organizing birthday parties. And but anyway, for me, I do think that there was that distance in the book, and there was great poignancy to the portrait of the parenthood, of the relationship between the mother and the father.
I appreciate that. I mean, it's funny, the time element, which occasionally I found myself in revision realizing that I had skipped something or even losing track a little bit. I had to go back as I was working on the book and just make sure I was keeping track of things in ways that would be legible and make sense for the reader. But I think it says something about the passage of time, right? So the book is fictional in ways that I've certainly, invented certain things, I've reorganized certain things that have been experienced, but it's also fictional in terms of what I've misremembered and what I've forgotten, right? It's that way in which these incredibly intense experiences of parenthood, particularly with a young child, that are in the moment, seemingly unforgettable. Within a year or two, the mystery of it, and maybe it's a response, as one of the characters suggests, to the trauma of sleeplessness. We have to forget how bad that was if we were ever to have another child. There's something about the way memory oddly degrades, even though these moments are as rich and vibrant as we could ever imagine in our lives in some way. So some of those gaps feel like that's also the nature of the fiction. The things that are left out feel like it's also the nature of the fiction.
Right, right. I was, because I mentioned this before our conversation began, I was trying to think about, I had this thought as I was reading it, probably because I'm a father and think about these things, but I don't think that's the only reason, which is that I was trying to think about works of fiction that where fatherhood is at the heart of the narrative. Like, there are so many novels about where there are protagonists who are husbands or who are fathers, but this is a novel in part about fatherhood for me. I mean, it's not parenthood more generally, but because your point of view character is the father. And I really was trying to think back, like where certainly in American fiction, it seemed hard to come up with. We have many examples of fiction about the experience of motherhood, but maybe a paucity of. I was going to back thinking about Evan S. Cannell's Mr. Bridge, which does have some similarities here. Your novel is at times mosaic, episodic, and so is that novel. But Cannell, you can feel that it's the son trying to imagine the hidden life of the father, whereas here it's really the father's consciousness, and at times the father's attempt to imagine the consciousness of the child.
Yeah, we were joking about this earlier on, and I was saying that the most famous writer father I can think about is the one in The Shining, who's not a great model, I think, in this regard. And certainly when I was writing this book, I was aware of and I'd admired several books that talk about parenting, but very much from the point of view of the mother. So Rachel Cusk's A Life's Work, Anne Enright's book, I think, Making Babies, I really remember loving. And I think I read those books actually when I had a small child. And so they were books that were important to me. And I was thinking about in relationship to that experience. Department of Speculation by Jenny Offel does some of the same spaces as well that I'm really interested in. And it is a little harder to think of ones that speak into the space of fatherhood. I think I mentioned, although I haven't read it for many years and only thought about it recently, Nicholson Baker's Room Temperature, which I feel like I maybe ought to go back and reread now. I'm an admirer of his work, but that's not one that I've reread recently. And I think probably also the other book that came to my mind recently in this context was Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is a very different kind of book, but I think it's actually... I remember reading that actually, and I think maybe reading an interview or a biography of McCarthy around that time. And I think one of the unusual things about him, I think this is true, is that he had become a father, I think maybe for the first time, quite late in life. He might have been into his 60s or into his 70s. And so this idea in that book of a father who may not be there for his son for very long in the post-apocalyptic space of them negotiating. That felt very poignant to me, that sense of an anticipation, which maybe for an older father might be a little bit more acute, but I think for all of us is somewhat present, that at some point these children will be out there on their own without us. We will no longer be there for them. That I remember striking a chord with me when I was teaching it, probably around about the time that I had a small child of my own. But I think the two books that I do think about, one about not quite fatherhood, but proto-fatherhood, anticipated fatherhood, that's also in this sort of autofictional space, of course, in a book that I teach fairly often, is Ben Lerner's 1004. Ben is thinking into, or the character of Ben in the book is thinking into, will I become a father or not? That one, I think, for me, is sort of bracketed a little bit with Sheila Hetty's Motherhood, because both of them are thinking about the choice. They're not actually quite fully embracing the role yet, but they're at the pre-decision point, or the decision to commit to one of those choices or the other. And that does feel like maybe an interesting space to lean into. I've just been writing a little bit for an essay about, the marriage plot being an old-fashioned narrative that's about the choice of a partner. And I feel there's a parent plot that to some degree is about the choice of whether we'll have children or not. And I think those two books sort of speak into that territory.
Yeah. The Road, I do remember, because I think I read that probably when I was when I was recently a father myself. That's a good example. And if I remember correctly, he based some of the dialogue on actual transcribed dialogue with his young son. So even though we're transported into that post-apocalyptic hellscape, you can kind of feel the tenderness of an actual father-son relationship in there. You call this, well, you are the father who teaches writing, creative writing, at an unidentified college. Seemed perhaps recognizable, the town in which the book is set. I don't think Literati makes an appearance, but perhaps it might have. The father thinks a lot about his, he calls his fiction in jest, in part because his students are so into YA apocalypse, is I believe what the father, your character is writing pre-apocalyptic fiction, which I kind of found delightful, but maybe true in a way. Right?
Well, or I mean, what I worry about now is that we're really writing, mid-apocalyptic fiction, right? That's maybe the space that we're in, I think. And actually also maybe informs, to take a slightly darker turn, I think, some of those choice points, right? Yeah. It's one of the questions I think a lot of people think about and we've thought about, is what it means to bring a child into this world with a kind of looming sense. I mean, there are a lot of things that are looming, but a looming sense of environmental threat and anxiety. I think that's a way that tunes up those parental anxieties that are always there, but have a new pitch, I think, under those circumstances. And I think the Road, I think, has touches of that as well, I should say.
Yeah, I think you're right. Would you read a little more? I know there are a couple of different, I mean, there's actually, there are so many sections of the novel that I would love to hear you read aloud, but we can't have you read an entire novel in a Literati book event.
It's a short one. I could probably fit it in, but no.
It's actually, I love. There is a kind of a form of the short novel, and I feel like you've written one of those, and I actually love the form where it feels, it has the scope, the breadth of a long book, but with a kind of compression that's lapidary. So
I love those short ones too. I maybe even it's sort of, I feel the form of the book in its short sections owes something to parenting, in the sense that there's a lot of distractions, there's not that much time. Can I write this while the child is napping? Those kind of rhythms that come into that space. But I think probably true, there was certainly a phase when the idea of reading a 500-page novel seemed impossible in the throes of parenting and the tiredness of that. So I personally enjoy short novels, and maybe it goes back a little bit to some of those parenting experiences as well.
Yes. Why don't you read a little more for us? Maybe a little bit longer than the appetizer that you did with.
So you mentioned the character is a father, but also a writer and a teacher. So I thought I'd read a little teacherly bit. And of course, we've been talking a lot about parenting, but as that first section begins to suggest, the trajectory of the first pregnancy here is ultimately towards abortion before there's a second pregnancy and a child ultimately. So I wanted to think a little bit into that space of the way abortion is thought of and handled in literature some of the time. So I'm going to read a touch from that. At the Father's College comes the day to teach Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, the abortion story that never mentions the word abortion. It's a classic, a staple, the textbook example of subtext. He's been dreading it. Half the class misses it always. Their reaction when it's explained to them range from a penny-dropping, oh, to grudging resistance. Well, sure, that could be what they're talking about, I guess. He looks around, their faces, the faces of those who got it, searching them this time, not for critical acumen, but experience, recognition. But he also resists the story. Its discretion seems perversely coy. Why shouldn't it use the word? Why, for that matter, should the most famous fiction about abortion be written by a man? He imagines a revision in which the redacted word is reinserted in every line of the dialogue, where the young woman leans across the cafe table and says, "What are you talking about? Oh, you mean the abortion, where the waiter asks, anything to drink with your abortion? The bartender winks, abortion, huh? Tell me about it. Where the other passengers waiting reasonably for the train stare out at the landscape and chorus, why, those hills do look just like pregnant bellies. Fuck subtext. Screw subtlety. The story normalizes shame. He recalls a similar technique being used in the 80s for stories about AIDS, stories that didn't name the disease. He doesn't teach those stories anymore, and he thinks if he did, his students would wonder, WTF? He makes a mental note to stop teaching hills like white elephants, to stop perpetuating the unspeakableness, to replace it with Alice Walker's The Abortion, or Anne Sexton's The Abortion, or something, anything by Grace Paley, said to have started writing stories while recuperating from, you guessed it, her abortion.
That reminds me, and maybe I can find it because it really resonated with me. There's a passage towards the end of the book where you really having a kind of extended meditation on writing. It's almost like you're, at times it felt like almost a fiction writer's Ars Poetica. And you concluded that section with a writer's job, they say, is to imagine the unimaginable. But he can't imagine life without the boy. Our job, he tells his students instead, is to say the unsayable, to speak the unspeakable. And I heard you just use that word in the passage you read. The unutterable made utterable by virtue of being written, whispered on a page, which I love. I mean, it's interesting because as somebody who mainly has been working in the field of essay, I do think that's something that the essay shares, certainly with this novel. But the unspeakable, the unutterable, seems like both central to the aesthetics of the novel and the plot of the novel. It's the novel, there's a big choice that's made in the plot, but it happens really early on. And it seems almost like the rest of the novel is a kind of the characters living through the aftermath of the choice and living through that sense of the unspeakable or shame, trying to escape shame, which gets to the title of your book, right?
Yeah, I know it draws from a quote from Anais Nin, that shame is the lie someone told you about yourself. And I think there's a way in which the unspeakable, I was actually just having a conversation this morning with somebody talking about writing that touches on trauma. And I think there's a way in which that writing in this book, and I think in the book of the person I was chatting to addresses two traumas in a way, both the experience, the event, whatever it might be, but also the kind of silencing that comes after that, the difficulty we feel about how do we talk about this, how do we express this. And that silencing can come from within, and it can come from without, that sense that we're not supposed to speak of these things. And I think shame has both of those qualities actually to it in certain ways. So there's a way in which maybe on the page, there is something I think that is different about the written experience from the spoken one, that there are things that I feel that we can express in writing and on the page that I think we would struggle to express verbally or aloud. I mean, the trivial way of talking about this is that as I joke with many of my students, that I wouldn't be a writer if I were any good live, as I'm possibly demonstrating at the moment, right? That there's something about the way we think as we write, we think on the page. And I think there's something about that that allows us also to tap into expression that we might not be able to reach for, even in an intimate circumstances, one-on-one with somebody else.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember, but I do think it was in the context of the essay that somebody saying that there's a way in which you create a privacy and an intimacy on the page in which you can confide what you would not be able to confide even to those with whom you're in your ordinary life are most intimate. There's something that's but what's lovely to me about this is that it's not a confessional. we're not, right? And in fact, it's sometimes the opposite. There may be an act of confidence involved, but the book is against shame.
Oh,
And
very much so.
it's against the judgments that people pass about other people, whether that's on social media, whether that's in our encounters at the grocery store with somebody who protests an abortion clinic. That there's a kind of intimacy and a confidence and a truth telling in the wake of trauma. But I feel like the father is wrestling to separate that need from shame.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex negotiation because I feel as though shame, particularly in the language of regret, gets weaponized in the context of the politicization of abortion. I think it's used as a cudgel. Oh, you regret that, therefore you shouldn't have done it. Whereas I think that regret, as the book talks about, is a form of grief. It's a form of mourning. It's entirely understandable. I think sometimes the circumstances, certainly for these characters, are regrettable, but the choice is not regrettable. The choice is the right choice for them, I think. So I wanted to push back a little bit on that use of regret, which feels like a very human emotion, and the use of it as a weapon against people who feel it. And certainly the book is, I think, in many ways against shame, but I think, well, maybe I'll read a passage we talked about a little bit, because I think it sort of speaks to, I don't know, maybe the odd redemption of shame in a strange way, possibly. Let me see if I can find this passage that I was thinking of. I thought I had it marked, but
wasn't it around 216, 217, 218?
Donovan, yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, so let me do maybe 3 or 4 pages here. And so this is talking a little bit about that compression of time that you're thinking about, these memories of parenthood. The child is a little bit more grown now. They, the parents, finally thought through all those photos. The boy in costume at Halloween, but also at pageants and plays, wearing his mom's shoes, his dad's glasses, a cape with his first underpants, subsection, funny hats, pilgrim, cowboy, hipster, etc. The boy with famous figures, dinosaurs, mascots, waxworks, Lego Obama, subsection, cute critters, otters, sloths, manatees, etc. Taking in the sights, the Lincoln Memorial, the Mall of America, the Magic Kingdom, and the M&M store. With food, gawping at birthday cakes and ice cream sundaes big enough to swallow him, wielding popsicles like lightsabers, hot dogs like baseball bats, crab legs like pirate hooks. And in the background, always the same wan extras, her hair still long, that dress, those glasses, cargo shorts, so young they look ancient. In a few more years, this is the boy, will travel places they've never been, form opinions they've never held, mention friends they've never met, fall in and out of love with one, move in with another. There might even be a child, a grandchild, or abortion. And how will his parents feel then? And what will it matter? What if you can't help? His wife asks him again, with any of it. They're out for dinner, the boy at a sleepover. Oh, you can for a little while, but you can't forever. Can you handle that? It's their favorite restaurant, the place they go for occasions, holidays, birthdays, anniversaries. They came when she was pregnant and when she wasn't, when the boy was in a car seat, a high chair, a booster. He nods, takes her hand. Only this is forever. And she rolls her eyes, because of course she does, because the more the boy changes, the more they stay the same. The boy will come back to visit, he tells himself, holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, to look in on us as he used to look in on his own parents. The old house, the hometown, the box, he thinks. We're in it now. The occasion this time is his book. It's finished, coming out soon. She orders a nice bottle. People are going to assume it's all true, she says, that I actually had a drinking problem. They'll think worse of me, he says. Maybe. She tops them up, but you deserve it. She raises her glass. He waits for her toast. Finally, she grins. Fuck shame. And he nods, clinks. Fuck shame. But that's not quite right, he thinks later. Toasts aren't true, only what we wish were true. Prayers with drinks. Sure, for the longest time he thought shame had fucked him, and of course sometimes often he wishes there were less shame in the world for the poor, the weak, the othered. Yet other times he wishes there was so much more, that the bankrupt businessmen, the paid-off politicians, the faithless preachers, all the profiteers and hypocrites who fill the news felt it more, felt it at all. Shame is the lie someone told you about yourself, according to Anais Nin, herself the author of several abortions. But what if it's not a lie? And what if the someone is you? It makes him think of Barb, opining one misty morning, shame just makes you human. Isn't that the lesson of the garden? Sure, God creates, but Adam and Eve only become human when they fuck up, when they know shame. And you know who doesn't know shame? The innocent. There's no shame in the womb. The low winter sun was beginning to break through, casting her shadow in the fog behind her. You know what the French call us, yeah? Faiseurs d'anges. Ooh la la, makers of angels. Better than baby killers, right? But still wrong. We're not making anything. They're already angels, beings of faith, not yet fallen, not yet human, because shame makes us human.
Yeah, that's better than being against shame. It's yeah. Peter, that was so lovely listening to you. I have other questions that I am curious to hear you ask, but I kind of wonder, since we're at around 7:40, if John might want to invite those listening into the conversation. And if we run short on questions, John, I can go to mine.
That sounds great. We do have questions to open it up to. The first is, I've been something of an evangelist for the Fortunes. One thing I loved from that book that's back in this one is the power of the pun. The novel is littered with them like cigarette butts on pavement. Many are laugh out loud funny, which only makes it so much more powerful when one of them strikes a chord of sorrow. Could you speak to how you approached wordplay, puns in this book, and maybe the Fortunes as well?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I mean, I think for me, it's partly the comedy that I appreciate. And of course, it's a very writerly humor to think about wordplay and puns in those regards. In the context of the Fortunes, I think it came to me late on that there was something about punning in English that echoed or resembled the way in Chinese certain words differently spoken will mean different things. And there's a lot of humor that comes out of that space. So it's a kind of analog, I think, for some of the humor in the Chinese language that I'm sort of finding an outlet for in English. In this, it felt very natural, not a particularly chosen route. There is a line in here that I'm pleased with, and I'm not the author of, so I will give it to its own author. There's a moment where father and son are at a Dairy Queen that would only be a few minutes walk from here, as a matter of fact, and it's very quiet, and the son's first pun is this place is deserted, he says. And that was my son's first pun, and I'm glad to have found a way to get it into the book. He's not that character in many ways, but it was glad to give a little sliver of him to that character, I think, in that particular space. So I should give him the credit for that. More broadly, I think and I hope the book is funny, because otherwise it would be difficult and grim, I think. So we need to have some of those spaces. But we often think of those two things as in opposition, and I think they go together hand in hand very naturally. I think I like to think of humor and laughter as a release of tension, and so it feels like in a book that has darker things and is tougher in various ways, that the laughs are deeper and heartier because they are a relief of that higher tension, I think, in certain ways. And maybe it's also a way that helped me get through the writing of the book. What I worry about slightly is that many of the jokes and many of the puns are possibly maybe, and I realize I've just been swearing a lot in reading from those extracts, but maybe still a little too rude to share in front of an audience and over Zoom.
I was just about to pull some of them for me, and I looked at, because I was writing, my shorthand was "ha!" exclamation point. But the one I just opened to, I cannot share, Peter. I cannot share. It's just. But there's some delightful. I think some of the humor also here feels really essential to the characterization of the mother and the father and their relationship. Like, it seems like even in the midst of moments of estrangement, the humor is something that they kind of never lose. And then too, I think in the relationship with the son, and maybe it's because parenthood is kind of inherently humorous. I mean, like, like you're wiping people's butts, and kids don't have these, the self-control that adults have, right? They'll say things aloud that we would never want to be said aloud, as the son does on a couple of occasions.
Right, they will say the darndest things. As
They
we
do. They
work
do.
to recognize. You're right, though. I do think there's a line, I think, in there about how marriage was a joke shared, and
Yes.
That partly reflects in this case on the character's slightly casual coming together, or the character's casual proposal. An ironized sense of proposing maybe in that context. But I do think it also reverberates with the longevity of the marriage in the book.
Yeah. Even in the scenes, and maybe you could talk a little about this, because there is a kind of, there's a section that comes kind of as a surprise. It's not a digression. It becomes very integral to the story. But we've been in a mostly domestic drama, and then the father decides to volunteer as an escort at an abortion clinic, and it's almost a set piece. I mean, certainly it's self-contained in the book, but even there's humor. Partly because the father, your protagonist, finds a delightfully irreverent but wise kind of mentor in this character, who calls herself pseudonymously Barb. So, but I'm curious about, since that section kind of stands out as a slightly different, we're suddenly away from the home, we're suddenly out with new characters, and I believe you did research into that, and so I'm kind of curious about how you work to incorporate that research into
very
this
well
novel.
that I did some research for that, because we talked about this when you were at GQ and editing there. I had a phase, this must be at least 10 maybe years ago now, I'm thinking, where I thought about writing a nonfiction piece about men volunteering as escorts at abortion clinics. And we talked about that. I did some research. I interviewed some people who were very helpful to me, and who I was very grateful to. And the project in the end didn't come to anything, but as nearly always happens, right? Things that we're interested in find their way back into our work. There's always, I was talking to some of my graduate students about this last semester, that sense that nothing is wasted, that we will often salvage shreds of research or shreds of writing that have come before. And so that fed into that space. I should say too that that's a section that has an interesting place in the book, because there was a very different structure for the book imagined at a certain point. It was very much a two-part structure. We talked about chance. There's a lot about coin tosses here. There are sections called heads and tails, and there was going to be a sense in which the book would have split very directly around those two things, having a child and not having a child. And the work at the abortion clinic was going to be one side of that narrative. And eventually, as work went on, I decided to draw the two halves together more closely. So there's a way in which that section is reincorporated into some of the other materials in the book, as well as a result of revision.
John, what do we got? I think there's maybe another one here.
Yes, there is. There's another on the topic of structure. One thing I love about this novel is how time is stretched, condensed, filleted, bent, and explored. Could you speak to how you thought about it and constructed the role of time in the novel?
Was that time is filleted in the novel? That's
yeah.
I like that. I hadn't thought about that, but I like that a great deal. It's funny. I wish I could speak to that more directly, but it felt quite organic. I don't know if it's true to what the experience was, or it was nature of the experience of writing the book. Um, but it felt like there was a kind of concertina effect, that I do think there's a real intensity to the early days of parenting. And then there's a little bit of a fast forward, a kind of blur quality that begins to accelerate, I think, in various ways. So I think it's reflecting some of those questions. Maybe the other way of thinking about this structurally, though, is that because the book is often composed in half-page or page-long sections, many of which sort of build on to one another, there are these sort of gaps between sections. And I think that partly allows for a kind of speedy transition. I realize in some selfish way, what was fun about this is not having to write the getting from A to B sections, just bouncing from one space to the next, which I think adds to the sense of speed or acceleration at various times in the book. But those gaps also feel kind of important to me. I realized when I was thinking about them, they come from a number of different places, maybe the fragmentation of memory in part, but I also think about them a little bit out of a different kind of form. I've been reading a lot of graphic novels, another thing that I was able to read more easily when I was in the midst of, early days of parenting. And I think those gaps also look a little like the gutters between panels in a graphic novel. And there's sort of an invitation to readers to sort of fill in the missing space, right? There are kind of ellipses, and there's an invitation for readers to think into those territories. Not least because I think the book obviously offers a father's perspective. And while the mother and the child are characters, there is an acknowledgement that you can't tell the whole story. You can't tell the mother's perspective of things. You can't tell the child's perspective of things. So there's a sense that I hope that those gaps are an acknowledgement that this is not the whole narrative, and maybe an incitement for readers to imagine into those spaces how other characters in the narrative might be experiencing moments that are only told to us by the father.
Or there's even that moment where the mother, it's almost like the father is in a kind of bizarre therapy as an escort at a clinic, and his unexpected therapist is this woman named Barb. But that coincides with the mother is in therapy, and she too is trying to write the story of the trauma that really is the central event in it. And so we get that hint of this ghost novel. Almost, you almost can imagine, like, what's her novel, what's her, which we're aware of, but of course we don't get to see because the father doesn't get to see.
Yeah, very much. I like that thought a great deal. It's funny, one thing that occurred to me, and Donovan, I know you've thought about this too, the kind of the history of usage of words. I think you've talked about words as almost having their own DNA in where their etymology is concerned, I think, in some ways. And I've often thought about the word author and authority, right? We think about that in terms of writing what you know. We think about it as the contract we have with the reader, I think, in certain ways. But there's also, when I look back at the etymology recently, I was struck that somewhere, again, maybe from the Latin, in the background of the roots of author, lie father and teacher. And so that there's that odd sense in which it's a very writerly book, of course, it's a very readerly book, but those things also feel as though they connect to fatherhood, to writing, to teaching. And so that one word feels as though it carries the DNA, right, of all three of those strands in my life. So while I wasn't very conscious of this as I was writing the book, it felt like one of those late revelations, epiphanies, where we come back and understand our own work later on.
So then that makes it seem really subversive of you in that passage you just read for us, when you say of Anais Nin, reminding us of the source of the title of the book, shame is the lie someone told you about yourself, according to Anais Nin herself, the author of several abortions. And that it struck me when I read that you must have thought about the word author in that sentence too.
Yeah, no, that was somewhere at the back of my mind. Probably also, I mentioned it comes up in the book. I think in the biographies, there's some evidence for it. It's also maybe somewhat apocryphal, but the idea that when Grace Paley turned to writing fiction, I think she'd written a certain amount of poetry before that point. She's often mentioned that she was ill. She was sort of confined. I don't know if she was confined to bed. She had children at the time, but I think she found herself, because of the illness, with time to write and turn to fiction. And in her own interviews, she sometimes attributes that illness to a miscarriage, sometimes to an abortion, sometimes to other illnesses. She talks about it as one of her two good lucks, the first of the good lucks, I think, that she experienced as a writer. So the idea of creation coming out of this loss, this abortion, feels really interesting in that space as well. A sharp and, to my mind, pretty poignant irony, I think, is the thing that I'm thinking into there.
Yeah. John, I know we have one more question here. Maybe we should do that.
Yes, absolutely. The viewer writes in, having spent time in Ann Arbor, the book seems very much set in Ann Arbor. I'm thinking of the Planned Parenthood there that I'm familiar with. How much did place impact the book's composition, if any? Yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, of course, this is the hometown event, even if we are scattered at different points around the town on Zoom. I know many of us are locals. But I very deliberately didn't name the town, name the college. I'm hoping that some of the details, I think it's identified as a Midwestern college town. So that does, invite the assumption that it is this space. But I think I also tried to leave it vague enough and generic enough that other readers could access it and feel as though this could be maybe not anywhere USA, but a number of different spaces. And I should say that, while I think for locals, some of these things may be recognizable, I tried to some degree to create some fictional space between that real territory and the one that the book is navigating as well.
Thank you. Donna, is there any sort of one last wrap-up question you might like to pose to Peter with our
no pressure, Donovan,
remaining few minutes here? I just want to give you the opportunity before we depart.
Well, I guess I'm thinking about this idea of pre-apocalyptic fiction, which I like quite a lot, and maybe we need more of that. I'll just speak personally without any judgment, because the book is reminding me not to always be sitting in judgment. But I think I'm tired of reading dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction. And there's wonderful examples. The Road came up in our conversation, but maybe I guess I would say I wonder if we're having this conversation, which is something we haven't really acknowledged yet, on January 7th. 2021, at the end of a year that certainly has felt like the most actually like dystopian in my lifetime, and I'm wondering maybe if I'm going to put the pressure back on you, Peter, as I kind of wonder. I don't want to oblige you to come up with some sort of simple saccharine or anodyne statement about the value of fiction.
That's more pressure, you realize.
Yes, I don't. Or you can, if you want to. You can go to something. But I do feel like I mean, there is. I genuinely believe there is, despite all, even in the midst of despair, when there's a sense of political urgency, when there's a sense, as you alluded to, of environmental urgency, that the value of writing or reading a novel still seems to me profoundly urgent and essential. And you talk in the book about how with children, we look for books that are soporific, that put them to sleep, right? And I was thinking, that's okay. I've been reading Lydia Davis's translation of Proust to help me get to sleep, and that's okay. And it can wake us up too. It can do both. But I wonder if you might want to say anything about how you feel about fiction right now in this strange time.
No, that's a great question. I think, as what yesterday's events suggest, but also the political environment we've moved through lately, but also even the ways we think about the pandemic. When we think about various conspiracy theories, competing visions of truth, we might think about conspiracy theory as a kind of toxic or bad kind of fiction, right? So there's maybe some way of thinking about the importance of fiction as a counter to those bad fictions. But that's the anodyne thing, right? That's to sort of say of one party, we need to tell better stories than the other side, right? So there's some part of that feels fairly familiar to us, I think, in some ways. And so maybe I'd like to sort of move away from the writing end of that, but get back to the point that I think you were also thinking about, which is the reading end of it, right? It feels as though one of the essential values of reading now, and I've been thinking about this for 3 or 4 years, reading is often about the suspension of disbelief. Do I believe this? Do I not believe this? Oh, that would never happen. Oh, I totally caught up in that. I completely believed in that. It's a testing space for our bullshit detectors, right? I think reading actuates us, makes us more discriminating, not just on the page, but in the way we read the world, we read other people, we read the environment around us. It feels as though we don't just need to tell better stories, we need to read better. And read more carefully and read more discriminatingly and read more. Maybe that's all I'm going to say, actually. Maybe that's the simple thing to think about.
And to purchase your new reading materials from Literati Books.
Thank you for the segue, for the serving that up for me. And indeed, you can purchase A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself from the bookstore. There's a link in the chat, and of course, there's a link on the event description that brought you here. You can drop it into your cart. You can pick it up curbside at Literati if you live in Southeast Michigan, or we can ship it to you anywhere in the United States. Thank you so much, both of you, Donovan Hohn, Peter Ho Davies, for really just a really wonderful conversation, and for a moment to suspend history and reality for maybe 45 minutes and talk about this lovely novel. We hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us, and stay safe and be well as well. And we'll see you at the next event. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Donovan. Thank you, everybody, for being there as well.
Good night, all.